So, Michael, for the benefit of the listeners, you are a cognitive therapist. Is that how you would describe yourself?
Rationally emotive behavior therapist.
REBT, right?
Correct.
And you're an award-winning author of at least 4 books.
Well, I've written 4 books. One was got some awards, and that's my main book, 3-Minute Therapy.
Okay, and this is what you practice in San Francisco as your profession?
Well, actually, I practice it internationally as my profession because most of my sessions are on Zoom, Skype, FaceTime, those kinds of things. So I have clients all over the world.
Okay.
I also have a podcast, a weekly podcast and YouTube called not Live and Let Live, called 3-Minute Therapy.
Okay, awesome. Well, we met in San Francisco through the general Live and Let Live movement. We used to meet up once a month and discuss liberty and ask each other kind of challenging questions. And
yeah, I think that was the Rothbard circle then.
Right. Similar theme, different name.
Yeah, right.
But what got you into an interest in human liberty?
That's a long history. In around 1977, I met up with Walter Block, and we both lived in Brooklyn, and a mutual friend introduced us because we both have an interest in chess. So we started playing chess, and in between chess games, we debated politics. I was a liberal Democrat then, big statist, in other words. And over the course of 2 years, I won most of the chess games and he won the discussions. And I became an anarchist libertarian at that time. And then when I ran up to Mark Victor and Live and Let Live, I added to the non-aggression principle, the aspirational values, which I think fills out the Live and Let Live and the libertarian discussion very nicely.
Just that word anarchist sounds quite extreme. Do you mind just explaining what you mean by that?
Yes, it is extreme from one perspective. From the mainstream, it's extreme because it means no overarching government, just we govern ourselves using one legal principle, and that is no initiation of aggression. Using aggression in self-defense is okay, but initiating it is wrong and tends to lead to many, many problems in society, in addition to it being morally wrong.
And so the anarchy is really a result of it's impossible to govern other people without initiating some force or aggression. And therefore, the anarchy is really a byproduct of the non-aggression principle. Is that correct?
That's correct. And it's impossible to govern other people without their consent. But I'm governed by my doctor and by my tech engineer and other people. So we're not throwing out a lot of the productive functions in society that are now state mandated. We're just throwing out the state mandate.
Okay, so voluntary power structures are fine. Some sort of centralization is okay. It's just the coercion that's the bad thing.
Exactly.
Okay. And you talked about the aspirational values. Do you mind just explaining what you mean by those?
Yes. So the aspirational values are an adjunct to the main rule, the main principle of Live and Let Live, the non-aggression principle. And that's ways to be more civil, to get along with people, as the founder Mark Victor says, to be a good human. And that consists of things like be tolerant, be respectful, be kind, be charitable, be open-minded. And if you add that to the main principle, then you really have not only a peaceful society, but a harmonious society.
Awesome. So Michael and I met at this Rothbard circle, as Michael was saying, and that meetup was characterized by the meeting of libertarians generally. But I think what I like about the Live and Let Live movement, which Mark Victor has started up, is that it focuses very much on these 2 points that Michael's talking about: the non-aggression principle and the aspirational be a good human, the let live being the non-aggression part and the live being the aspirational part. I think it's a subtle shift of focus towards the things that are not okay, towards the things that are that we should be doing to optimize our lives and the lives around us to further human flourishing. So it's great that Michael and I seem to share this enthusiasm for the movement. I'm just kind of giving a backstory here, Michael. Is that a fair summarization?
Oh, yes. Enthusiasm is an understatement. It's a wonderful light and spark in my life to speak to people about the Live and Let Live philosophy, to learn more about it, to watch the many videos. They're peace radical videos where Mark and Andy, another attorney at Attorneys for Freedom, interview people. I was interviewed on that, and many notable people were interviewed on peace radicals, and you can learn a lot more about it by watching those videos.
Great. So, Michael, I'm keen to hear from your perspective what the most compelling argument you could give for Live and Let Live is, given the fact that we are very niche in the world, in the sense that most people like the idea of Live and Let Live, but when it comes down to it, and we really understand what quite radical implications that a truly Live and Let Live society might have, it maybe doesn't appeal to everyone. So what's the most succinct selling points you can use to help convince people?
Well, it depends on the person, but for me, the most succinct selling point is world peace. There are many governments at war or potentially at war, and although over the centuries it's been reduced to some extent, it's still a threat. And as Mark says, there's a threat of nuclear violence between country leaders, which would affect us all. So that's the most compelling thing, that this is a way to avoid that by teaching people the Live and Let Live philosophy, don't initiate an aggression, and getting the word out, and maybe at some point it will filter down to leaders. In fact, Mark is running for Senate in Arizona, so that is getting the word out as well. And maybe one day we'll have a Live and Let Live candidate who wins office. I think one of the main ways to influence the world is to start with influencing politics, getting voters on board, and spreading from there.
I agree. One of the fun things about exploring Live and Let Live is imagining what the world would be like if we all did agree to not be aggressive to each other. Could you help us understand, let's say the UK, where I'm based at the moment, adhered to a Live and Let Live principle. How would we protect ourselves against a potentially hostile country like Russia right now, given it's in the mines? And how would we ensure peace in the face of aggression?
Well, if you look at a country as a whole, we're looking at leaders. And the more we influence leaders not to initiate aggression, the more of a, well, there are a few things, the more of a role model they'll tend to be to other leaders, and other leaders will see how well the country is doing where the leaders follow this economically and in terms of prosperity, in terms of harmony. So that would be a great role model for other countries and other leaders and other residents to lobby their governments to get on board with that. So that's one thing. And then another thing is that if one country lays down their arms and is not aggressive, then other countries, and when I say countries, I really mean the political leaders, then other countries would have little incentive to start bombing them and trying to take over and things, those kinds of things, because usually leaders do this at least under the excuse of feeling threatened. We're responding to the threat of Ukraine or Russia or those things, so we better be armed or hit them first before they hit us. So there would be less incentive on that grounds also.
Right, so it's a kind of radical de-escalation, giving zero excuse to a foreign aggressor to spin some propaganda about being the rightful or the righteous invaders when you're attacking a truly peaceful country.
Right, and also being a good role model and showing the world how this leads to more peace, prosperity, economic advantage within the country.
And presumably that economic advantage could be invested in defense, right? Like it's okay for a peaceful country to have means of defense. It's just it's the initiation of force under any circumstances, which is the wrong. But having means of defense is okay, would be another argument, I guess.
Yes, as long as the means of defense isn't coercive in any way. For example, if a country has nuclear arms on the excuse that, well, we're going to defend ourselves, at some point, when you point a gun at someone, it becomes a threat and coercion. So there would be a fine line to draw there at some point. What bearing arms is a threat and what isn't. But overall, the big picture is normally it's not. So that certainly would be allowed as long as the residents of the country are not taxed in order to support the military, because taxation is an expression of the initiation of aggression.
Okay, thanks. So the spending on defense has to be voluntary again, which exactly. Presumably it would be. Exactly. Okay. Exactly. And nuclear bombs would cause collateral damage and therefore inherently are aggressive. Got it. So, Michael, when you were winning your chess games, what were some of the arguments you were losing to Walter Block? Where did he manage to convince you?
That's a good question. My last argument to go was gun control. I was a lefty, a good lefty, so I was in favor of gun control because it's not people that kill people, it's guns that kill people. So we have to ban guns. So over the course of 2 years, Walter got me out of that nonsense also.
How did he do that then? Because I think that's another one that intuitively is a tricky one. So what were his key arguments?
Yeah, well, it was a process, and one of the arguments was if you don't use a gun aggressively, then you can own a gun for defense. And there's a qualitative difference, a key difference between having a gun for defense and having a gun to use to initiate force. Also, a gun is a great leveler. So the weakest among us can defend themselves. Old, fragile people can defend themselves. A woman in a wheelchair with a gun can overpower a mugger who is using the usual mugging method, which is force, physical, muscular force, that kind of thing. So it's a great leveler. Okay, another good argument was that most crimes are stopped not by shooting anyone, but just by the brandishing of a gun. Often when someone breaks into a house with the intent of theft, if they see the owner just having a gun, they get out of there. So that was another good argument.
And I suppose it's a little bit like having a long, sharp carving knife in the drawer. It also could be used as a tool of violence. But if it's to carve up your bread and it's not intended for violence, then it's fine. And it comes back to this non-aggression principle. And is that a fair summary as well?
Yeah, yes. Also along those lines, Robbie, I've been asked, well, if you're not going to use a gun for aggression, why do you need a gun? Well, there's no reason why you have to have a reason to have a gun. If someone has a gun and they're not using it by initiating aggression, there's no reason why they have to justify it, because not justifying it is not initiation of aggression. But there are a variety of reasons for owning guns. One is you may collect guns. You may be a collector, or you may like the looks of a gun, or other reasons. It may remind you of the old days, the cowboy movies, those kinds of things, when people use guns, and that was a lot of fun. It was just a movie. So there are various reasons, and there's no reason why anyone should have to justify it.
A slightly unusual question. I don't think I've asked anyone this before, Michael, but was it a difficult process for you to go from being a sort of a righteous social democrat to losing those arguments, and at what point did you realize, okay, I might be wrong here? And was that an exhilarating feeling of entering a new world of possibilities, or was it a kind of death of a previous personality?
Actually, it was a former, and I like the way you described that, Robbie. It was exhilarating. I like to be proven wrong, because when I'm proven wrong, I get smarter, because I have a new idea. The old idea goes away, and my new idea makes me a smarter person and helps me operate in the world better. So it's really wonderful to be proven wrong. And that's why I like to debate with people, argue with friends and things like that. Once in a while, I get proven wrong. Fewer and fewer times these days, since I'm getting so smart, but it still happens, and it still is, as you say, an exhilarating feeling.
What about some gray areas? At the moment, it seems like abortion is tearing a deeper divide into an already divided country in the US, where you mentioned earlier with the point at which aggression is initiated via a threat being somewhat subjective, and that line is not crystal clear. And I guess abortion is another one of those examples where at some point this is a human being whose life is being ended, and we may disagree amongst a rational, logical society about what point that is. So how would you tackle that very thorny subject?
Well, I'll tackle it in a few ways. From my own individual perspective, and also from the perspective of the Live and Let Live movement. And I think the Live and Let Live philosophy says that with these thorny issues where there are people on both sides, then any particular region, smaller community, then the whole world would decide for the people in that community about abortion. My own view about it is that a fetus is a human life at some point. I don't know exactly the medical way of measuring it. It could be when there are noticeable brain waves or a heartbeat or something like that. But at some point, the fetus does become a human when those things are evident. And then the mother who owns her body, that's her property. And so the fetus is a trespasser, and she can either decide to keep the fetus to term or remove it in the gentlest way possible. It would just be as if someone was camping out on your lawn and you didn't want them there. It would be wrong to just shoot them, but to start using the gentlest means possible. First, trying to persuade them to get off your lawn, maybe bribe them, maybe drag them, call the police, but certainly not shoot them as the first step. So I think that's somewhat analogous to the abortion argument.
Okay, so to paraphrase, a mother is the steward of her own body. So what is in her body is really up to her. That's her jurisdiction, but she cannot actively kill another life. So she could take this other life out of her in a way that doesn't actively kill the baby. So that might mean putting the baby on an incubator to the extent that that is possible, and then maybe look for an adoptive parents. But I guess the really thorny point there is that if no adoptive parents are found and the baby is too young, maybe the baby would die, but it would be a passive. It wouldn't be an active death. It would just be that the baby wasn't able to support itself, which I guess would hopefully there'd be lots of people that would therefore want to be adoptive parents, but presumably there are cases where that doesn't lead to great outcomes.
Yes, and I learned that argument or that perspective from Walter Block, and he calls it evictionism.
Okay. Michael, you're also a vegan. Are you still a vegan?
Well, there are different kinds of vegans. There are whole food vegans, junk food vegans, raw food vegans, environmentalist vegans, animal rights vegans. I'm a health food vegan. I believe health food, whole food vegan. So I believe the healthiest diet is eating only things that grow in the ground and unprocessed. So that's my dietary approach. And I've seen a lot of research that seems to support that. If you want to see research, look up Dr. Michael Greger, Greger, and he has lots of research. He has a very large book with many, many references called How Not to Die, not how not to ever die, just how not to die from terminal diseases like heart disease and cancer and diabetes.
And going back to the two aspects of live and let live, the legal non-aggression principle and then the aspirational how to live a good life and being a good human, would you say that veganism is how does the live and let live principle deal with animal rights is another way of phrasing it?
Actually, the live and let live principle doesn't deal with animal rights. It deals with humans and how humans treat each other. So it doesn't really have an official statement on animals, eating animals, although many that I know in the movement are whole food vegans like Mark Victor. And Mark has a Peace Radicals interview with Colin Campbell, who wrote the very popular book, The China Study, which offers a lot of research and evidence that this is the healthiest diet, if that's of interest to you. Although there are many people who prefer taste to health, and that's certainly their right to eat food that they think tastes good. I happen to think this diet is delicious. It's hard when I start a meal, it's often hard for me to stop because it's so good.
One of the things I've really loved about meeting people like you, Michael, and others who are of the mind that live and let live is a good philosophy to live by, is that you often come across different ways of seeing the world, which are maybe very different to the mainstream, and that can be very, as you say, it kind of helps build a better working model of how the world works. But I love the original thinking that goes into it, and I guess that's partly why some people have the animal-free diet. For myself, I spent 2 years as a vegan, and started getting a bit sick with the flu, and found that actually eating a bit of meat helps me. I was an environmental vegan, but
Not a whole food vegan, is that right?
I mean, probably secondarily a whole food vegan. Yeah.
Ever since I've been on this diet, and that's been for about 15 to 20 years, I've never gotten a flu shot. I've never gotten the flu. I didn't get any COVID shots except in the very, very early days, which has run out already. And I've never gotten any symptoms of COVID. So I don't get colds at all. So I credit all that to my diet.
I certainly think the living food diet is good. I also think that different bodies have different needs, and maybe there's not a one size fits all. But so just moving on, Michael, given I gave myself the last word on that one, what are some of the biggest injustices you see in the world? You mentioned war as a pretty obvious one, but what are some of the other ones that really you wish you could sprinkle a bit of understanding of the live and let live principle onto?
Could we segue into psychological problems in the world, since my profession is as a clinical psychologist, and as you mentioned earlier, I've written 4 books on it. The main one is 3-minute therapy. So it's not quite an injustice, but it's one of the greatest myths of humankind that's been perpetrated throughout history, and that is that our emotions come from situations. So you'll hear someone say, I'm depressed because I was fired. I'm jealous because my wife is cheating on me. I'm anxious because I have a deadline at work I may not be able to meet. So that is indicating, quite wrongly, that our emotions come from our situations. I'm anxious because of my deadline at work. So it's being late for the deadline at work that's making me anxious. Or it's being my wife cheating on me that makes me feel jealous. But that's not the way we work psychologically. The way we work psychologically is our emotions come from our thinking, our views, ideas, perspectives, opinions in our head that causes our emotions, not situations. And you very rarely hear someone express their emotion in that way. It's usually the emotion, the situation causes our emotion. A way to look at that in a diagrammatic way is A, B, C. A is the activating event. So let's say the event is, I was fired. C is the emotional consequence. C is, I feel depressed. But A never causes C, it's B. It's B, the belief about A, that causes our emotions. And there are a particular type of thinking that causes disturbed emotions like depression, anxiety, anger, and guilt. And that's thinking in terms of demands. Must, should, supposed to's, have to's, escalating our preferences into demands. For example, because I prefer not to be unemployed, which makes sense, therefore I absolutely must not be fired. It's the end of the world. This proves I'm a loser. I'm no good. I can't stand it. So it's that kind of thinking that in rational emotive behavior therapy, REBT, we call irrational thinking, because there's never any evidence for musts and shoulds and supposed to's and have to's. There's just evidence for our subjective preferences. So our preferences make sense, but not the demands.
So if I lose my job, there's a belief that this is a terrible thing. It's the belief that causes the anxiety that pursues, that ensues. But the loss of my job is still subjective, I guess, but feels pretty. I could come up with a lot of real reasons how that would make my mortgage payments less likely, or which could lead me to live on the streets. Or so let's say I I can't pay off my mortgage and I end up living on the street. Is it the same process of ABC, it's the belief that living on the street is the problem that would then cause the anxiety, and actually you can still be happy on the street?
Well, that would be hard to be happy on the street. And if you were, that's more power to you. But yes, as you expressed it, Robbie, that's correct. It's your belief about living on the street. Or let's put it in another stark way. Let's suppose I go to my doctor and my doctor says, you have terminal cancer, you have 3 months to live. Now, obviously, I would be very sad about that, and that would come from my strong preferences. I strongly prefer to live a long, healthy life. This is very, very bad, and I can list 100 reasons why this is very bad, but that's all it is. It's just very bad. It doesn't mean I can't get some enjoyment out of my life until I die, and it comes from the must. I must, my misery, not my sadness, sorrow, regret, but my misery, depression comes from my must. I must live a long, healthy life. I can't stand knowing I have a short time on the earth. This is terrible, horrible, and awful. And it's not the end of the world. It's the end of my world or my existence in it, but the world will go on, no matter how special I think I am.
So the subtle shift is from must to could, rather than I must continue living. It goes to I could continue living, and it's less.
It's a subtle shift, but there's a qualitative difference there.
Right.
A key notion here is there are no psychopathological musts, shoulds, have tos, needs. There are just our human preferences. That doesn't mean we don't have disadvantages. That doesn't mean we're not going to be sad or very, very sad if a loved one dies. It's reasonable to mourn, to grieve, to cry, those kinds of things. But that comes from strong preferences, very, very strong preferences.
And so, Michael, bad things happen to all of us. When bad things happen to you, how do you still feel anxiety, or have you managed to? I guess if you do feel it, are you quite quick to figure out which belief is driving that anxiety and changing some of the imperatives to coulds?
Well, that's a good question, Robbie. And I feel a lot less anxiety, a lot less depression than I did when I was 18, when I was first introduced to Albert Ellis, who is the genius who created this approach, REBT therapy, rational emotive behavior therapy, and changed the course of psychotherapy movement from the traditional type of therapy where the therapist offers a compassionate shoulder for you to complain on, talks about your childhood and your crazy family and the abuse you suffered, and claims that's what's making you upset and disturbed now. But again, it's not any of those things. It's your thinking now. So to answer your question, Robbie, about how I employ this, when I was 18, I had many, many emotional problems, depression, anxiety, procrastination. I had an addiction. I was addicted to chess. To escape school, I would go to the student lounge and play chess. But now I got a PhD, so I largely mastered the avoidance of schoolwork. And I rarely feel terribly anxious, depressed, guilty these days. I have a very good life, a functional life. And I also teach my clients to be their own therapists. I do the ABC type outline, and then there's a D, E, and F where you change your thinking. A, B, and C is identifying your irrational thinking, the musts and shoulds. D, E, and F is steps where you change it. And you learn to be your own therapist and do that with yourself and change your thinking, thereby change your emotions and dramatically improve your life, which I've done over the years, again, with the help of Albert Ellis.
it's quite confrontational to say, even if it's true, that my anxiety is not caused by my surroundings, it's caused by my own voluntary beliefs. Do you ever find people are feel threatened by the message that you give, or are most people fairly receptive and accepting of the facts of it?
Well, just about everyone that come to me for therapy is fairly accepting, and they have some idea of my approach because they know about it from my YouTubes and my Psychology Today blog and my book. But in the old days, when I started practicing therapy, and I was around 19 or 20, my clients expected me to ask them about their childhood. But these days, people seem much more enlightened. And when we zero in on their disturbed thinking, they go right along with it. It makes a lot of sense. And it works quite well. I teach them to be their own therapist. Now, there is a notion within REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, that is more controversial and harder for people to understand. And that's this whole idea about self-esteem. So we teach that self-esteem, high self-esteem, is a toxic concept, just as low self-esteem is. And that's because when you esteem yourself, you feel good about yourself. That's a feeling, that's an emotion. So it comes from your thinking. And the kind of thinking that leads to high self-esteem or low self-esteem is normally rating your total self based on the rating of your behavior. So if I won the race, it's good to rate my behavior. That's good, that's very good. Or if I got a raise, that's good, but it doesn't make me a good person. So rate your behaviors, but don't rate your total self. And if you give up self-esteem and you don't rate your total self, what's left? And what's left is unconditional self-acceptance. Accepting yourself as the imperfect human you are, which you always were and always will be, whether you do well or poorly, or people like you or despise you, you're still the same imperfect human, no matter what. So that's a very important concept in REBT, and most therapists don't teach that, as they don't teach that our emotions come from our thinking.
Really, really awesome. It leads to a kind of equanimous, egoless state, I would imagine, to not have esteem, either positive or negative. Michael, you also wrote a book called Rational Drinking: How to Live Happy with or Without Drinking. Would you mind kind of linking the REBT with this book?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is the main principle is our behaviors and emotions come from our thinking, not from situations. So it goes for addictions. So let's suppose if you have a drinking problem, it's not because someone offered you a beer that forces you to drink, or not even because you have a genetic predisposition to drink, which you may, but it's because of your thinking about it. And normally the thinking that leads to addictions is something like, because I prefer to have a drink and satisfy my urge, therefore I must, I have to. So we get back to those absolutes. Or because everyone else at the party is drinking and having a great time, I have to join in, and I can't stand being the odd person out. So I have no choice than to drink. But if you look at it this way, the way it's caused through your thinking, obviously you have a choice. There's a book called Addiction is a Choice by Jeff Shailer, I think it is. And that really says it all. Addiction is a choice. And if you want to choose non-addiction, then go back to your musts and shoulds and your thinking. Question, challenge, and contradict them, and work against them.
So that has to happen in real time, I suspect. When you have to be quite aware of your own thought process to notice this beer is put in front of me, preference is to have the beer, but to be aware of that internal dialogue and realize there is much more choice than the habit of accepting the beer. And then must take a lot of willpower as well, right?
That's a great question, and it's a question I often get, and it seems right intuitively, but it's wrong. And the reason it's wrong is if you want to develop a new perspective, a new way of thinking without musts and shoulds, you don't do it in real time. It's just like if you want to go to France and speak French, you don't learn French in real time when you're in France, but you better start studying the French months before you go, and then you go to France with some French in your head, and you're able to speak French with the natives. So it's the same with this. So the time to work on changing your thinking and giving up your musts and shoulds is not when you're at a party and tempted, but it's to practice a new way of thinking on a regular basis. And one of the main ways you can do it is by writing out these ABCs, or 3-minute exercises, I call them, the A, B, C, D, E, F. So let me run through the D, E, and F since I ran through the A, B, and C. So A is I have a temptation to drink. B is I must satisfy my urge. C is drinking, consequence, undesirable behavioral consequence. Then D, we go on to be little scientists or lawyers, and we say, what is the evidence for this belief? That because I have the urge, I must satisfy it. D stands for disputing or questioning the irrational belief. And then we go on to E, effective new thinking, or the answer to the question. And if you think about it, there's never any evidence for musts or shoulds. As I said, if I have a terminal disease, there's no reason I must live just because I prefer to live. There are no musts, they're all fictions. So E, effective new thinking, would be something like, although I prefer to have a drink and join in at the party, there's no reason I absolutely must. I can stand the discomfort of not satisfying my urge, of being the only one at the party not drinking, even though I don't like this urge. It is unpleasant, but hardly the end of the world. I've survived urges before that I haven't satisfied, and I will survive them again. And it's not the urge that forces me to drink, but rather it's my irrational must and need thinking about it that gets me to drink. And with practice, much practice, I can change my thinking. And that leads to F, a new feeling or behavior, and that would be abstaining from the alcohol rather than compulsively drinking.
It sounds very simple, but also so different to the way we're commonly wired that it sounds like a conversation with you privately, Michael, would be very helpful for me, at least. Not so much on drinking, but procrastination and many other things. So I think probably everyone listening could probably think of something that they could benefit from a conversation with you too. And
I have some openings, Robbie, so feel free to contact me and make an appointment. And as I mentioned, my practice is international, mainly on Zoom, but we could do Skype or FaceTime. And so anytime you viewers would like to make an appointment or inquire about making an appointment, you can go to my website, 3minutetherapy.com, the name of my book, and 3 is spelled out. And there you'll find my email address and my phone number. And I'll be happy to speak to you about an appointment or just answer questions about any of these ideas or how it applies to you.
So, Michael, you've talked a lot about the REBT, the cognitive therapy that you practice. How does that link to the Live and Let Live movement or practice?
Yes, and good question, Robbie. And an aspect of the Live and Let Live movement and philosophy involves not only the non-aggression principle, as I mentioned earlier, but also the aspirational values. Just to review those, aspirational values are things like act civilly, act tolerantly, be respectful, be open-minded, be charitable, all the good things that a person can do. And often people block themselves from doing these things, from being outgoing and warm, friendly with others, is anger, resentment, and hostility. And again, our emotions come from our thinking, and anger, resentment, and hostility has a demand on another person. You should treat me kindly, fairly, agreeably, reasonably, reciprocally, warmly, and if you don't, you're no good. So it starts with the master demand on others, and then leads to a global valuation, which leads to these emotions. And when you feel anger at someone or resentful towards someone, you normally don't feel like you're not going to act in terms of these aspirational values. You're normally not going to be civil, for example. So what we do in REBT and what we could do in the 3L philosophy is teach people how to overcome their anger, resentment, hostility, creating musts and shoulds, so they feel more open to implementing these aspirational values.
Okay. And part of that is, I suppose, losing any sense of victimhood and taking personal responsibility for those emotions, so that you're no longer so swayed by them and have more sovereignty over them. But I suppose there's that all looks at the live part, the aspirational values part, but it could also make the let live, which is obviously a law and not a choice. We don't have the choice to cause violence towards someone else, but having a healthier mind, a healthier emotional response to circumstances might also help with the let live part too. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, if you don't make yourself a victim, in other words, I must have more control of my life, and if I don't, I'm a victim, and no one has 100% control over their life. So it's always nice to have that idea. But if you escalate that into a must, I must have total control over my life, and you're asking me, requesting, or even telling me to do X, Y, or Z, then I don't have full control. So that's the victimhood. And then that often adds to, and you shouldn't treat me this way. You should allow me to do whatever I want to do. And that demand on another person causes the anger, resentment, hostility, and tends to block reaching out to other people and being open-minded toward them.
I love it, Michael. Your external philosophy is very much married with an internal behavioral model, which are very complementary. So I'm convinced. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And I gave a talk at a conference called How to Achieve a Personal Individual Freedom in an Unfree World. And that's exactly what you're referring to.
Right, because I was also thinking that part of becoming aware of what we believe is injustice around breach of the live and let live principle, it could make the world a bit of a depressing place if you're just on a daily basis confronted by all the unfair laws that have built up through decades of political cycles. Paying taxes every year. I had to pay taxes in the US and the UK. Once you recognize that they are funding unjust wars, it can be an unpleasurable experience. But I suppose the 3-minute therapy helps to also not get emotionally wound up by some of these external factors relating to statism as well.
Yes, and especially the REBT principle, because as you said, the REBT is the internal corollary to the live and let live external aspirational values and principles. And you made an interesting error in saying, could what we're living in here could make it a depressing world. Well, keep in mind, and that's a common mistake. So keep in mind, the world is not depressing. The world is a situation, and then we decide whether we're going to depress ourselves about it. So there are other ways to view the world without musts and shoulds, by focusing more on the positives. Mark Victor is a very good role model for this. Mark Victor never seemed depressed to me, and he's probably aware as much as anyone about all the bad, negative, harmful things going on in the world.
Michael, thank you so much. I've learned so much from you over the years, but even more this evening. And you're a great ambassador for peace in the 3L movement, the Live and Let Live movement. So I wish you very well, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Robbie. It was great being an interviewee here.